In this video, we're going to get started and putting paint down. This is called blocking in. So you see I have it all drawn up, ready to go. What I'm going to actually show you here is a finished portrait of Mitch, just to explain some of the process. Blocking in is actually putting in the major shapes and making sure that we are working on the entire image. We're not just concentrating on Shelley or the details, but we're also making sure that we are looking at the relationship between the figure, Shelley, and the ground. The example I'm going to show you here is Mitch. You can see here that Mitch is in the centre of this image, but the background is quite subtle, but underneath you have these really, really vivid colours. So on the ground here, I've got this lime green, and you can see it just poking through in some of these areas. On the top, it's a really, really hot pink, and you can see how that hot pink is actually showing through the layers of paint. Around the mouth and the face and the eyes, there's a really bright electric blue. Paint is designed to be layered, so all of the detail doesn't go down in the first go. If we considered how this painting's been constructed, the very first layers were bright green, hot pink, and then some of the electric blue, and then some of the tonal areas coming in. So I'm going to show you how we actually do that first up. So come with me, and when we consider these really, really bright colours. For the painting of Shelley, I've chosen a bright orange. Shelley is a kind of honey-coloured colour, and you can see that that colour is much, much brighter than the honey-coloured colour. In the background, I'm going to go for electric blue. I quite like the subtlety of the background here. It does actually sit in, but that blue will actually provide me a great foundation. And for those of you who know a little bit about colour theory, orange and blue sit very, very differently, opposite each other on the colour wheel, which means that they're complementary colours, which will make Shelley jump forward from the background. And so we'll have a real separation of where Shelley actually sits in relationship to the ground. Let's get going. So I'm just going to lay out my palette here. I've got a plastic plate, nice and large. What you'll notice here is I'm not going to use white on this first layer. I'm really concentrating on pure bright colour. I've got a slightly darker brown. I'm going to use that for some of the tonal areas. And here's my bright orange. Plenty of paint to block in the whole area. There's a little bit more blue, I think. I've got a separate blue for the top as well. So two different types of blue for the ground, and a bright orange and a slightly darker colour. No white, I'm not mixing at this point in time. The brushes I'm going to use when I'm blocking in are very large. You can see the size of this particular brush. The purpose is not to worry about the detail here, but actually cover the entire canvas with paint. So the biggest brushes I can find to block in the background, and then a little bit smaller when we tackle Shelley, but you can see they're still very large, and we're just going to block in very, very loosely. I'm not going to add water to my paint either. I'm going to use what's called a medium, and mediums are really important here. As we know, when we clean up or wash up with paint, we usually wash up with soap and water. So what water does is dilutes the paint and breaks it down. A medium, however, gives you more flow, gives you more flexibility with the paint, but it's not breaking it down. And so you'll get a richer surface. And that's really important as we begin to layer the paint on top of each other. So I'm just going to add a little bit of retarder here to my palette, and I'm going to mix that with the paint rather than water. And away we go. So you see I've just dipped my brush straight into the retarder and then straight into the pure colour without dilution. I'm just going to begin with the ground. Very boldly and very quickly blocking in the whole area. Now, when I use a little bit of retarder on my brush, it's actually going to dilute that a little bit, and I can actually get some tonal variation within the paint as well. You see that area in here is much lighter than what it is over here. So I'm using the white of the canvas to actually mix the colour rather than actually mixing white with the paint at this early stage. I'm not too concerned about putting any detail in at this point. I'm really just wanting to layer that colour down. I'm not even going to wash my brush this time, and I'm just going to pick up the darker blue for the top and continue blocking in the background. You've noticed I've concentrated on the background first. It's really important that we consider this as a finished painting at all times. And so what I mean by that is that we don't concentrate only on Shelley's face and we finish that before we've considered other areas such as the background. What that means is the white, as we know, is the brightest colour. And if we are responding to that background as white, we're not actually making the right decisions about tone and colour as we're laying it down. So the first and most important thing is get rid of all of the white. We can always put it back in over the top. And white as a highlight is added very, very last. Changing up my scale of brush just really quickly. You can see I have quite a few brush marks in this background. I can actually start to play with that too. I can get some nice energy around the image just by dragging the paint. Rather than having it matte and flat, consider how the brush mark can actually add to the dynamic nature of that background. Okay. I'm just going to add a little bit of darkness in here just to indicate a bit of tone, just where Shelley is actually sitting. I'm going to blend that background a little bit seamlessly so there's not such a sharp line. And our first layer and our background is in. Now we're going to concentrate on Shelley. I'm going to change my brushes. And we're going to do the same thing with the two different colours. I'm adding a little bit more retarder to my palette. And I'm going to start with this very, very bright orange. Don't be shocked by the brightness of the colour. It's intentional. And as we layer it up, we will actually pull it all back so it does become far more harmonious. Okay. So as in the background, we're using the white of the canvas to actually mix with the colour so that we start to actually form some tone. And what I'm talking about here is clearly some of these areas are darker and some of these areas are lighter. The movement from dark to light gives us that form, and that's what we're going to use here. So I'm going to use very, very thin paint here so that it appears much lighter, and thicker paint on the edges to actually give us that variation in tone. Let's have a go. You can see I can still just see my outlines here, which are going to be really, really helpful for just keeping some of those, the drawing in place. So I know exactly where Shelley's arm and leg starts and finishes. Okay. You can see how I'm applying darker, thicker paint on the outside to give it a sense of a different tone, and then I'm going to thin that down quite substantially. To cover in some of the lighter areas. To do that, I've just added more retarder to my brush. And you can see how much thinner the paint is there. It's barely there. But already we can start to see the modelling of the form. Just moving that paint around. You notice too, I'm not concentrating too much on those edges. Sometimes the blue bleeds in to the orange. I'm not really too concerned about that at this point in time, because once we start adding more layers, we'll be able to work more closely with some of those areas. So again, I'm using thicker, drier paint to carve out some of those lines and those tonal areas based on my drawing there. And then I'm going back with a slightly different brush with more medium on it, with the same colour, much, much thinner, to fill in the lighter areas. It does need to be a little bit darker on the top, and so we're going to just keep adding a little bit more paint in those areas until we're satisfied with how the overall form is taking shape. You can see how the medium allows the paint to dry very slowly, and I have plenty of time to move the paint around the surface to really work those tonal areas. And at this stage I can still see my drawing a little bit, so I'm still actually using that as a guide. If you put too much paint down too quickly, in this earlier area and with the medium, it's really easy just to wipe it back with a soft cloth or even a rag. So for here, Shelley's back paw is actually quite light. It probably needs to be a bit lighter, so I can just use a cloth to actually give me a bit more white. I can open that up a little bit too. Just in some of the areas where I think I've actually put too much paint. Go back on and keep working over some of those sections. You can see when I've done that, those feet become just more defined. That's much better. I haven't concentrated on her features, but I am going to do that. I'm going to use the same technique, but I am going to use a slightly darker brown just because they will go towards nearly black or even a kind of chocolatey colour towards the end, but that's going to allow me to see where those darker areas fit. I don't want to lose the drawing altogether, so I am just going, just because the face is quite important to getting the personality of the portrait right. I'm just going to add some of those details just so I still have the drawing and making sure the shape is actually right. Clearly that nose has come up too far, and I'm just moving the paint around till I get that in place. And the same with the eyes. You can see that the areas with the most detail I've left to last. And I'm just putting those in very simply. They are really important, but that detail is actually put in at the very last area, at the very last, when we're kind of finishing the painting. I'm just using that slightly darker tone to fill in some of the details, tonal details within the face, to keep a hold of them. Okay. As you can see very, very quickly, the painting has been covered. Now, clearly it's not finished at this point, but it can actually be left. We have actually covered the full area, and now we just keep layering and layering the paint on top of it. But you can see that the figure and the ground are very, very well established within that blocking in.